Hello everyone. In this lesson we are going to begin our discussion of respiratory physiology. This lesson will expand on the discussion of anatomical terminology in our last class and essentially begin to gain an understanding of how these different structures match the functions. By the end of this segment, you should be able to answer all of these questions that you see on the screen now. There are, of course, a lot of different terms and a lot of different concepts that I'm going to go over, but at the end of this, you should be able to have a pretty good understanding of all of these topics. So, in general, the respiratory system functions not only in just breathing in and out, exchanging gases, but a lot more than that. In our discussion of anatomy, we talked a little bit about vocalization, right? Of course, air flowing out of our respiratory system, flowing out of our mouth in a very controlled way, and of course modified by different structures within the larynx, different structures within our mouth, such as our tongue, our lips, etc. This gives rise to vocalization, and so our respiratory system is critical in communication between humans, right? So not only for the good of the individual human, but of course the population of humans. So the respiratory system really has so much more to it than simply breathing in and out. Also, you might already know that the respiratory system functions in olfaction. Right, so as we inhale air, it flows into our nasal cavity. Those nasal conchae are going to create turbulence and essentially fling those odorant molecules to the sides of our nasal cavity, in which, in some places, there are embedded neurons, so olfactory neurons, which of course send a message to your brain what exactly you're smelling. Okay. Also, the respiratory system functions in regulation of pressure. Okay, so if we look at this image over here to the side, we can see the thoracic cavity and we can see the abdominal cavity that is separated, of course, by the diaphragm. Now, the diaphragm, of course, functions with the respiratory system, and so when the diaphragm contracts, it ultimately contracts downward. Right? So it essentially expands the volume of the thoracic cavity, but at the same time the thoracic cavity is expanding down farther, the abdominal cavity is getting smaller. Okay, and so as we're going to talk a lot about today, as volume expands, pressure decreases, and as the volume decreases, pressure increases. And so when you take a deep breath and hold your breath, take a deep breath and hold it, so you're holding your breath, your lungs are filled with air, and of course your diaphragm is way down here. Essentially your abdominal cavity pressure is going to increase quite substantially. And so we can purposely regulate abdominal cavity versus thoracic cavity pressures in different functions such as childbirth, right? Defecation, right? Urination. So essentially, it's almost instinctual to like hold your breath when you are pushing really hard for any of these purposes, and as a result of that holding your breath, your abdominal cavity pressure is going to increase and therefore push out any of these substances. Also, as we discussed in the cardiovascular system, this additional pressure in the abdominal cavity actually blocks off the venous drainage, right? The IVC, venous drainage up into the heart, right? And so extra pressure here is going to keep the blood pooling down here. And so this is thought to be what killed Elvis, right? And a lot of other senior citizens have issues with defecation over time because just in general your body begins to dry out, and so defecation becomes more difficult, and so if the individual holds their breath to facilitate defecation, this can actually lead to problems, of course. Right. Next, the respiratory system functions in the regulation of blood pH. We're going to talk a lot about this. The respiratory system, the urinary system, as well as the blood all play a huge role in pH. Okay. Of course, respiration, right? The respiratory system functions in gas exchange. We use oxygen in our cells. Our mitochondria need them in order to make ATP. And as a byproduct of aerobic respiration, our cells release carbon dioxide, and that, of course, gets exhaled through our respiratory system. Okay. As we're going to see here in just a moment, the process of respiration itself is gas exchange, but ventilation is the movement of air. So the respiratory system both has to get new air in and old air out and exchange the gases with our blood. Okay. Air preparation, again, we talked a little bit about this when we discussed the anatomy of the respiratory system. If you are running on a really cold day, your nasal cavity, your pharynx, has to kind of warm and moisten that air so that it doesn't freeze your alveoli. And finally, something that also might be a little surprising is that the respiratory system functions in a large way in our immune system. Okay, not only can it cause us to cough and to sneeze, but also when we breathe air in, we are essentially taking components of the outside world into our body, and we are putting ourselves at risk for infection by anything that happens to be in that air. Okay. Which leads me to discuss part of the immune system. We're going to talk about this later this term and kind of put all of these different pieces together, but right now it's really important for you guys to understand that our body puts a lot of effort into creating these very selectively permeable or sometimes even impermeable barriers to the outside world. And so this diagram over here to the right shows us kind of a representation of our body, right? So on the outside of our body, we have the skin, and that lets in very little stuff from the outside world, right? Bacteria, viruses, fungi, really inhospitable weather characteristics, right? So this is a barrier that tries really hard to keep stuff out. We, of course, can secrete sweat, which contains antimicrobial compounds. We can secrete oil, which also has antimicrobial compounds. We support a microbiome of different types of what we like to call the good bacteria to fight off anything that we really don't want in our body. Right? So our skin, of course, is very selective about what comes in and what comes out, and what leaves. Okay. But we also have these surface barriers, always epithelial tissues, that line the passageways into our body, right? And so, for example, the digestive system is a long continuous tube. Right, from mouth to anus, you take in hamburger molecules and you process those molecules. You take certain stuff into your blood, right, like the proteins and the carbs and the lipids, and then anything that you don't quite need, of course, leaves via defecation. And so even though your hamburger is in your body, right, it disappears when you swallow it, you don't see it for a while, it's not technically in your body yet. And when I say it's not in your body yet, I mean that it is still isolated within this continuous tube. Right? There are epithelial membranes that are lining this tube, and so they are very selective about what can come in. Right? We want nutrients, right? What passes over this membrane, and what remains in the tube until it goes out with the wash. Okay, this other image over here on the left shows us a typical epithelial lining. This one happens to be within the intestines, like we're talking about. We can see that there are specialized cell junctions. Here we have tight junctions. There are also desmosomes. There are gap junctions, right? So pretty much any kind of food that is up here cannot, or food and pathogens and anything that you have taken into your mouth and therefore into your digestive tract, it cannot pass in between these cells. It would have to go through these cells, and in order to go through the cells, there have to be specialized proteins, specialized mechanisms for actually taking them into your body, right? So crossing over this epithelial lining and entering into your blood. All right, so again, we put a lot of effort into these surface barriers, our skin, as well as the epithelial linings of the different organ systems of our body, in which we specifically invite outside stuff into our body. And so I bring this up now because the respiratory system is one of those organ systems, right? We take in air from the outside world, we bring it into these respiratory structures, and the lining of our respiratory system is very selective about what it lets in and what it is going to exhale back out, right? The CO2, of course, is leaving, and oxygen, and hopefully only oxygen, can actually cross over these alveolar membranes and get into the blood. Now, once something gets into your blood, it is in your body and it's going to circulate all throughout your all of your organ systems, and essentially it's a lot harder to deal with, a lot harder to get rid of something if it is already in your blood. So the goal with these surface barriers is that we want to keep out anything, any kinds of pathogens, before they ever get into our body. Okay. As we can see on the slide, the skin is the strongest of these surface barriers, right? It's keratinized, many layers of cells, right? It is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. But the digestive system and the respiratory system both use what's called a mucosa, right? So usually these tissues are simple, so one single layer of cells, be it squamous or squamous, cuboidal, or columnar. And so essentially these are a little bit less resistant to invasions by pathogens. And so really you want to be very selective about what you're breathing in and what you are ingesting as far as food and drink. Okay. These mucosal membranes do secrete some substances, just like our skin does, that essentially helps to reduce invasion, right? So different types of antimicrobial secretions. We nourish the good bacteria, the symbiotic bacteria, particularly in places like our colon and our oral cavity. And another kind of cool trick, which we'll be going into a lot more in the next section of this class, is that right just deep to these surface barriers, okay, so deep to the epithelium, both in our respiratory system as well as our digestive system, we have little lymphatic structures, and these lymphatic structures happen to be populated with our white blood cells that essentially are making sure that nothing can get over the membrane. If it has, it's going to be dealt with right away. Okay, so again, just keep these things in the back of your mind. We will be going into them in a lot more detail as we go on, but always be thinking like, yes, the air is coming into your body, but it's not technically in your body until it crosses over one of these membranes. Okay, so the respiratory system, right? Its primary function is gas exchange. Right, so this involves exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the respiratory system and the cardiovascular systems. We can generally break this process down into 4 sub-processes. First of all, we have pulmonary ventilation, right? So vents, like when you think of vents, you think of air moving through something, and so pulmonary ventilation is literally taking air into and out of your lungs. Once the air is in your lungs, we can complete the process of what's called external respiration. And so respiration is a word for gas exchange. External means you're exchanging these gases with the outside world. So the air you're breathing in is what you are exchanging with. Okay. Next, we have to actually transport those respiratory gases, right? So we want to take oxygen to our tissues. We want to pick up carbon dioxide from our tissues and ultimately be exchanging these things via our cardiovascular system. And finally, once the blood gets to our tissues, we complete the process of internal respiration, right? It doesn't do us any good to have oxygen in our blood if that oxygen can't be unloaded from our hemoglobin molecules to our tissues, right? So oxygen, as you might remember, can bind reversibly with hemoglobin, right? It jumps on in the lungs and then it jumps off again in the tissues. And so again, these 4 processes really are involving this dynamic relationship between the circulatory or the cardiovascular system as well as the respiratory system. It really is external respiration where we see the most complex and important relation between these or interaction between these two systems. Okay. If we think back to our discussion on anatomy, remember we walked through all of the structures of the respiratory system from the nasal cavity and oral cavity all the way down to the alveoli. We essentially followed the pathway of the air as it's coming into your lungs. And so if you think about all of those structures, we can further break them down into two zones. Okay, the first one I'll talk about is the respiratory zone. So this is the one that's actually doing the process of external respiration. It is the site of gas exchange. All of these structures involved in the respiratory zone have extremely thin membranes. Okay, they have very high surface area. So if we look all the way down here, we can see each individual alveolus has its own respiratory membrane, and this membrane is as thin as possible to facilitate gas exchange. The rest of all of the structures in our respiratory system are called the conducting zone. And the reason for that is that their membranes are too thick to allow for efficient exchange of gases with the surrounding capillaries. And so essentially air comes into these structures, right? But the composition of oxygen and carbon dioxide is not going to change within these structures. Okay, so essentially the sole purpose of the trachea and the bronchi and all the way up through the terminal bronchioles is to conduct gas to the respiratory zone. And so if we were to measure how much air is coming into your body during a particular inhale, it would be approximately 500 milliliters. Okay, so half a liter, and about 150 milliliters of that is just within the conducting zone, right? So even the deepest breath that you're going to take, 150 milliliters of that is going to be stuck in the anatomical dead space within this conducting zone structure. And so this is called anatomical dead space because, well, first of all, dead space means that it is not actually able to exchange gases, so respiration cannot occur in any structure that's called dead space. And this is anatomical dead space as opposed to pathological dead space because we need air to be filling all of these structures, but really only so that air can get down to the respiratory structures themselves. Okay, so again, this is anatomical dead space. It is everything from our nasal cavity all the way down to the terminal bronchioles. So once again, let's take a look at these structures just as a brief review. We have our upper respiratory system, so our nasal cavity through our pharynx. All right, so this is what is most immediately exposed to the outside world. These structures work really hard to trap any particulates in the mucus layer that is on the epithelium. Right? The upper respiratory system's job, in addition to conditioning the air and kind of filtering it, is to pass it down to the lower respiratory structures, including the respiratory structures. Okay, the lower respiratory system involves the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles. Right, so all the way down until we reach the smallest of all the bronchioles, right, the respiratory bronchioles, and their alveoli. Okay. We left off in our last lesson talking about the alveoli themselves, so I just want to talk about this for a moment more. The alveoli are hollow structures. Okay. All right, so they are hollow structures that are interconnected with these little gaps in between the cells so that all of the alveoli can have air passing from one to the next to the next. Each alveolus is surrounded by an alveolar membrane, which includes two different parts. First of all, there are the simple squamous cells of the alveolus itself. Okay, so this is the thinnest possible tissue we can have in our body, and this allows things like oxygen and CO2 to very easily pass over the membrane. The other part of the respiratory membrane is the capillary membrane. Right? So these are continuous capillaries, and so they are also lined with simple squamous epithelial tissue, and so literally this 2 layers of cells is unbelievably thin. All right, so this is about a 1/2 micrometer thick, so like a 1/15 or something the thickness of a piece of tissue paper. Very, very thin, and this is important because we need to have a really efficient surface for respiration. So this needs to be as thin as physically possible so that there's very little resistance to the exchange of gases. Furthermore, these alveoli membranes are always covered with fluid, and that's going to be really important. We absolutely need fluid in order for gas exchange to occur. Right? So in order for oxygen to diffuse across the membrane, it first has to dissolve in water. Okay, so fluid covering these alveolar surfaces is absolutely critical. Okay. Of all of the cells that make up the alveolar portion of the respiratory membrane, the most common are type 1 alveolar cells, or pneumocytes. These are the most common. They are really where most gas exchange is going to occur. There are a second type of cell within the alveolar membrane, and those are type 2 alveolar cells. We'll talk about these a little bit more at the end of this presentation, but for now, just be aware that they are roughly cuboidal in shape as opposed to squamous, and as a result, they don't really allow much gas exchange very efficiently. But they are critically important in making something called surfactant. And surfactant is a type of molecule that interferes with the hydrogen bonds between water molecules. Right? Remember, there's this lining of fluid over the surface of the alveolar membrane, and so it is critical for these surfactant molecules to break or to minimize the surface tension, and that's going to become important in decreasing the surface area to prevent the collapse of the alveolus. Again, we'll talk about that more at the end of this presentation. Secondly, these type 2 alveolar cells are really important in maintaining the alveolar health. Okay, so they repair the tissues, right? There's really not much going on in simple squamous cells, so all of the organelles and mechanics to actually fix any damage to the tissue, it's all living within these type 2 cells. Also, they secrete antimicrobial proteins, right? So if any microbes have actually gotten all the way past your nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, all of these different structures which are trying to trap pathogens and particulates before they get to your alveoli, if any of that stuff has actually gotten past, right? So this right here, there are a couple extra layers of protection, such as these antimicrobial proteins. Also, we have what are called macrophages. Okay, so this cell right here is part of your immune system, and its job is to be a macro-big phage eater. And so we can see it's sticking a little piece of its cytoplasm way into the alveolus, and it is endocytosing. It is eating this particular pathogen, which has gotten past all of those other structures on the way down to your alveoli. So the macrophages, as well as these antimicrobial proteins, essentially are cleaning up the alveoli. Okay, and something I mentioned before, there are open pores that connect the adjacent alveoli, so air pretty much flows unrestricted from one to the next to the next. Okay. Final note about the alveoli, they're surrounded by fine elastic fibers, right? So they're really stretchy, so they can go from really tiny to really big with from inhale to exhale. And so naturally, the lungs want to recoil, right? So you can think about pulling the elastic on a pair of pants. It naturally wants to be a little bit shorter, and so our alveoli naturally want to be a little bit smaller than they are when we inhale. And so this allows us to expand quite considerably, right? Stretching out the pants and then releasing when we exhale, and automatically the alveoli, the pants, get smaller. Okay, let's zoom out again and examine the entire respiratory system and add in this a few details about the respiratory epithelia, right? So the surface barrier that we know is very important in keeping pathogens and particulates and stuff out of our lungs, out of our blood, therefore out of our body, and how it changes on the way down to our alveoli. Okay, collectively, the tissue that is lining the majority of our respiratory tract is called the respiratory mucosa. For the most part, the respiratory mucosa consists of pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. So we can see that here. This single layer of cells has cilia, and it is, of course, is covered with mucus that is produced by the goblet cells. This respiratory mucosa, the pseudostratified tissue, is going to line the entire nasal cavity, right, the nasopharynx. It stops for a little bit in the oro and laryngopharynx, right? Remember that this is stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and it is because when we chew and swallow our food and drink, that those abrasive substances are going to travel through this part of the pharynx, and so we need a little bit of a thicker layer that is much more protective than the respiratory mucosa. Okay. Finally, the air, of course, is diverted down into the larynx, trachea, etc., and we see the respiratory mucosa again. Right. So the pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. All right, this type of tissue lines the respiratory tract until we get to the very tips of this respiratory tree. All right, so the bronchioles, and finally this, the alveoli. These are lined with simple squamous epithelial tissue, again, because we really need the thinnest possible membrane to facilitate efficient gas exchange. Okay. Our respiratory system has a series of filtration mechanisms as the air is traveling deeper and deeper into our respiratory tree. As we discussed in the anatomy lecture, we have essentially a ring of tonsils that surrounds any place the air is first entering into our body. So it surrounds the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, right? And it's a broken ring. If we take a look at this diagram here, all right, these pharyngeal tonsils are in your nasopharynx, these are at the opening to your oropharynx, and these are kind of at the boundary between your oro and laryngopharynx. And so if we use our imagination, we can see that they are essentially a ring around incoming air, right, via your mouth as well as your nasal cavity. All right, so as we're going to learn about a lot more detail towards the end of this unit, tonsils are essentially lymphatic tissue. They are just deep to the epithelium, okay, and this loose reticular connective tissue provides this nice structure, this nice framework for our lymphocytes, white blood cells, very important in our immune system, to kind of hold on to these reticular fibers and patrol anything that is going past, right? So if you breathe in some kind of bacteria or virus, and the air kind of swirls around here, these white blood cells can recognize that, that doesn't quite look normal. We probably shouldn't let that into our body, and so they can take care of it right away, right? So they'll pull out that virus, that bacteria, right out of the air before it gets farther into our lungs. Next, I keep talking about this mucus. It really is important, even though it might sound kind of icky. The mucus, of course, traps particulates from the air as well as pathogens. And the fact that our respiratory mucosa is ciliated is also very important, right? So these cilia are going to create a current, right? So they're going to wave around, and essentially the collective beating of these cilia, right, the movement is going to push like a wave the mucus up and out of your respiratory system, right? So all these structures here are aligned with this ciliated tissue, and the collective beating of these tiny little cilia is going to push that mucus up and up and up your trachea. Okay, we can see that here. Here's the respiratory mucosa, and that mucus with all of the funny gunk that's trapped inside of it is going to be pushed up and up and up and up and up until you can actually swallow it, right? So up out of your larynx into your laryngopharynx, and then you can swallow it down your esophagus, right? So very important. Of course, if you are a smoker or live in an area that has a lot of particulates in the air, right? So you live in a very industrial area or a very urban area. Maybe you are a bus driver or something and you're always kind of breathing in those fumes. Essentially, all of that stuff, all that gunk is going to kind of stick up, gunk up these cilia, and so they're physically not strong enough to push that gunk up and out of your respiratory system anymore. And so that's why you hear smoker's cough, right? Smoking anything. You physically can't push all that mucus up and out anymore, so you have to forcefully try to eject it out of your respiratory system with a cough. All right, speaking of which, our respiratory system can very crudely, very forcefully get stuff out of it, right? So a sneeze, a sternutation, or sternutation is the fancy word for sneeze, and this, again, very crudely clears pathogens from your lungs, right? Just ask questions later, get it out now. And so this is a reflex, and it is under the control of your lower brainstem, just like a lot of these different reflexes are. Okay. Finally, the macrophages in your alveoli, as I just discussed, are constantly patrolling and kind of munching up any kind of debris, any kind of pathogens that have finally made it all the way past all of these other defense mechanisms. Okay, so before we move on through this PowerPoint, I want to do a couple practice questions with you. So first of all, the respiratory epithelium of the conducting zone. Right, so not the respiratory zone, the conducting zone, right, an anatomical dead space, consists of what type of tissue, right? As we just left off talking about, this consists of ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It does not have to be thin because it's dead space. It's just kind of holding the air. It's just existing there. It's not actually exchanging gases. And of course, the cilia help us to produce this mucus escalator. Okay, next, damage to the type 2 pneumocytes, the alveolar cells. What would this result in, right? So essentially this is a more applied way of asking what do these cells do, right? Because if there's damage to them, they couldn't complete their normal functions. So if you remember, these type 2 cells are the cuboidal ones, not the squamous ones. Type 2 produces surfactant. Surfactant, we know, is involved in reducing surface tension. If there is a lot of surface tension, our alveoli cannot stretch and inflate, and therefore they can't take in as much gas. They can't take in as much oxygen, and so there would be a decreased rate of gas exchange. And also, remember, the alveoli are surrounded by these elastic fibers. They always want to be smaller, right? Just like, you know, your pants are thinner until you pull them out, until you stretch them over your body, and then, you know, that elastic gives, right? And so if the type 2 pneumocytes were damaged or they weren't fully developed, right, during fetal development, all of these things would happen. Okay. And finally, which of the following is false about the trachea? Well, the submucosa contains hyaline cartilage to keep this airway open. That is absolutely true. These are the C-shaped hyaline cartilage discs, which always keep a patent airway. The vestibular or false folds of the trachea can be adjusted to produce variable pitches in speech. Well, this is wrong on two fronts. First of all, these vestibular folds are not involved in speech. They are merely involved in closing off your airway to keep food from going down the wrong tube. And these folds are in the larynx, not in the trachea. All right, so this one is false, we know that, but let's go through the rest to make sure. The C-shaped rings and the trachealis muscle allow the esophagus to extend into the tracheal lumen. This is true, right? So when you swallow a big bite of hamburger, your esophagus actually extends into your trachea just a little bit. This would not be possible if the rings of your trachea were O's, right? Were a solid ring instead of a C-shaped ring. And as part of the body's first line of defense, the cilia of this layer move trapped substances towards the esophagus. Yes, we just talked about that. That is the mucus escalator. And so it is absolutely, we were right the first time. B is false. Okay, let's now zoom out and look at both lungs as a whole. In A&P1, you probably learned that there were three types of what's called a serous membrane or serosa. The first one is the pericardium, right? It's a double membraned or double layered membrane around the heart. Another is the peritoneum around your abdominal organs. And finally, we have the pleurae, right? So the pleural membranes are around each of the two lungs, right? Pleura for singular, add an E for plural. Okay. As I said, this is a double layered membrane. And so the parietal pleura is along, essentially fused with the wall of the body. Right? Parietal means wall, and so it's just deep to your rib cage and your intercostal muscles. The second layer is the visceral membrane, the visceral pleura. And so this is essentially attached to the surface of the lung. And in between these two layers is fluid, right? So this is pleural fluid, and essentially this fluid is very important because this allows the two layers, the visceral and parietal pleura, to slide along one another without friction. Right? So think about it, every time you inhale and exhale, your lungs are essentially rubbing against your rib cage, right? Your rib cage goes up, your lungs go out, and so to prevent any abrasion on the surface of your very delicate spongy lungs, we have this fluid which naturally lubricates the surface of the lung. Also, it provides surface tension. Right? So as long as there's this little bit of fluid in between the two pleural membranes, and also the two membranes are completely intact, the surface tension between them is actually going to more or less glue these two layers together. Right? So they can slide up and down along one another, but they cannot pull apart. That is, the visceral membrane and the lung that it's attached to cannot pull away from the wall of the body. Once again, as long as we have this fluid, right, just a thin layer of this fluid, not a lot of fluid, and as long as both pleural membranes are intact, the lungs are pretty much going to do whatever the ribs do, right? So if the rib cage swings up and out and the diaphragm gets contracted down, the lungs are also going to expand with the movement of the ribs and the muscles. Okay, this is only possible if the membranes are intact. So if there is some kind of puncture wound, right, or extra fluid buildup in between the two membranes, what this does is it reduces the surface tension. It allows air and fluid in between these membranes, and so the surface tension is no longer enough to keep the lungs inflated. And so as we can see down here, the lung will automatically recoil, right? So remember, all the alveoli are surrounded by elastic fibers, and so they are going to get shorter and pulled along inward in the absence of that surface tension. Okay, this is called lung collapse or atelectasis. We'll talk about that more later. More specifically, pneumothorax, pneumo meaning air in the thorax, right? So the puncture wound up here has allowed air to get in between these two layers of the membrane. Okay, so again, the lungs are pretty much going to do whatever the ribs and the diaphragm do. And so in order to facilitate inspiration, inhaling, and expiration, exhaling, we need to move the ribs and the diaphragm. Okay, so pulmonary ventilation consists of two different phases. Inspiration or inhaling, this is the active phase. This is what it actually involves the contraction of all of these muscles. Okay, as opposed to expiration or exhaling, this involves the relaxation, right? So the same muscles are involved, but one involves using ATP to contract. The other one involves just letting go of those cross bridges and lengthening the sarcomeres once again. Okay, remember these are skeletal muscles. When we contract the external intercostals and diaphragm, the diaphragm is brought down, the ribs are brought up, and ultimately this increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Okay, we can look at this in another way. Here is a flat diaphragm down here. Okay, so that is contracted, and then when it relaxes, it automatically relaxes upwards, therefore allowing air to leave from your lungs. Okay, and so air is essentially going to follow its pressure gradient. Okay, so essentially breathing in, breathing out, inspiration, expiration is going to facilitate changes in volume of the thoracic cavity, which will ultimately lead to changes in pressure, right? And air, just like blood, just like anything else, is going to follow its gradient, in this case, its pressure gradient. Okay, so in order to talk about changes in volume and pressure, let us discuss what is called the Boyle's law in a little bit more detail. Boyle's law states that essentially pressure and volume are inversely related. So as pressure goes up, volume goes down, and vice versa. And we can see that in this beaker here. We have a certain volume of the beaker, right, with this stopper up here, and we have a certain number of air molecules inside. Right, so these air molecules are essentially moving around erratically, and they are bumping into the sides of the beaker, they're bumping into the plunger, etc. And so that bumping into the sides is what gives rise to this pressure. Now, if we push this stopper down, we essentially have the same number of air molecules, but now there's less space for them to move around in. So they're still moving very erratically, but now they're going to be bumping into the walls even more because there's less space, right? They're just going to bump in more often. And so same number of molecules in less space or less volume means that the pressure is going to increase, right? So remember that Boyle's law states that as volume decreases, the pressure is going to increase. And again, we know that gases are always going to flow down their gradient, in this case down their pressure gradient, until pressure is equalized, right? Until there is an equilibrium in pressure. Okay. As we increase pressure, or sorry, as we increase volume, right? So we're inhaling, the volume of the thoracic cavity goes down. As we relax our diaphragm and intercostal muscles, we are decreasing the volume and therefore increasing the pressure within our thoracic cavity. The one final piece of this puzzle that we have to discuss before we get into the different pressures existing inside and outside of our lungs is atmospheric pressure. Even though we don't recognize it, we don't consciously experience it, there is pressure exerted on our bodies by the air around us. Right? This is called atmospheric pressure, and at sea level, so where Stockton is, the atmospheric pressure is about 760 millimeters of mercury, also called 1 atmosphere. Okay, those numbers aren't critically important to us, right? What is important is the pressure of our lungs relative to the pressure outside of our bodies. Okay, so all of our respiratory pressures, inside our lungs, inside our pleural cavities, etc., are described relative to atmospheric pressure. And so we're going to say this is, the pressure in our lungs is greater than or less than atmospheric pressure, and so this is where the air is going to flow. So, for example, negative respiratory pressure, right? So pressure less than outside, or negative respiratory pressure is less than what it is outside our bodies. Positive respiratory pressure means that there's more pressure in your lungs than there is outside your lungs, outside your body. And 0 means that you have reached an equilibrium. So let's add some more terms as always. Intrapulmonary pressure, or P sub pul, right, is the pressure existing in your alveoli, so in your lungs. Okay. Again, this is the pressure within the alveoli, and this is what is very important in comparing to atmospheric pressure. Over the course of an inhale and exhale ventilation cycle, the intrapulmonary pressure will be greater than atmospheric pressure, less than atmospheric pressure, and ultimately equalize with the pressure outside your body. There's also pressure within the pleura, right? So within this double membraned or double layered membrane around the lungs, there is a little bit of pressure. This pressure does fluctuate with breathing. So if we looked at the absolute numbers, we would see that there is a little bit of variation over the course of an inhale-exhale cycle. But at all times, the intrapleural pressure, or P sub IP, must be negative, right? That is, it has to be both less than atmospheric pressure and less than the pressure in your lungs. And the reason for that is that if the pressure in here is is greater than what it is in here, right? The greater pressure is going to push on the lesser pressure, right? So the, always going down the gradient. So we're going to have this pressure being exerted in this direction. So we're going to have the lung surface being pushed inward, and remember, it kind of wants to recoil and be tinier anyway. And so whenever intrapleural pressure becomes equal to or greater than the intrapulmonary pressure, the lungs are going to collapse. Okay, so if P sub IP ever becomes equal to or greater than intrapulmonary pressure, you get atelectasis. Okay, what can cause this, or rather what ensures that intrapleural pressure is negative? Well, essentially, there are always these inward forces, right? The elasticity of the lungs always wants to pull the lungs inward so that they are much smaller. Okay, alveolar surface tension is also pulling the alveoli and therefore the lungs inward, right? So everything wants to recoil, but both of these inward forces are opposed to the outward force of the chest wall. Okay, so essentially your ribs and your intercostal muscles are much, much stronger than the elastic fibers and the surface tension of your alveoli. Okay, so as long as your rib cage is intact, right, good thing, and as long as that pleural cavity is intact, right, and therefore it is pretty much fused to your chest wall, right, then your lungs will remain inflated, right? If you take the lungs out of the body, or if you poke a hole in that pleural membrane, the inward forces are all of a sudden greater than the outward forces. Intrapleural pressure becomes equal to or greater than intrapulmonary pressure, and your lung recoils and collapses. Final pressure that we talk about a little bit less, but the difference between the intrapulmonary and the intrapleural pressure is called the transpulmonary pressure. Essentially, the greater the difference between in here and in here, the larger the lungs are going to be. Okay, so now we have all of the pieces of the puzzle to be able to talk about inhaling versus exhaling. And for an exam, you should be ready to talk about what the muscles are doing, what the volume is doing, what the pressures are doing, and whether air is coming into or out of the lungs. Okay, so let's put all that together. Inspiration, again, is inhaling air from outside the body to inside the body. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to actively contract our muscles. Right, again, the diaphragm contracts down, right? So this is the volume, and when the contraction happens, right, all of a sudden we have a lot more space that's going to be filled up with the lungs. Also, we have the external, in particular, external intercostal muscles contracting, and so your sternum swings up, your ribs swing up, and so your chest, of course, when you inhale, puffs out a little bit, right? So now we have much more volume in our thoracic cavity than we had before. Okay. As we know, as the volume of the chest, of the thoracic cavity increases, the pressure is going to decrease. Okay, so volume of the chest increases, the pressure is going to decrease. And so we see that it goes down by like 3 millimeters of mercury, but now inside the lungs has less pressure than outside the lungs, right? Just a little bit, but it's enough, right? So atmospheric pressure is now greater than intrapulmonary pressure. As we know, air is going to flow down its pressure gradient, and so air is going to flow from high pressure to low pressure into the lungs. Okay, until intrapulmonary pressure equals atmospheric pressure, right? Until an equilibrium is reached. All right, so when intrapulmonary pressure is less than atmospheric pressure, that is when we get inhaling. All right, and kind of a little trick here, when we use these greater than, less than signs, whichever way the arrow is pointing, that's where air is going to flow. So this one is pointing towards the intrapulmonary pressure, towards the lungs, and therefore air flows into the lungs. Quiet expiration is a passive process. So first let me define quiet expiration. Quiet expiration is calmly exhaling, right? It is not forcing air out at all. That is, when you talk, when you sing, when you play the tuba, when you whistle, you are forcing air out of your lungs, right? That is not quiet expiration, that is forced expiration, and that requires the internal intercostal muscles to forcefully push your thoracic cavity down, okay? We are talking about quiet expiration, right? Just normal old exhaling, not talking, not singing, not whistling. Okay, again, this is a passive process, which means that muscles aren't contracting. They are passively, without any energy, just lengthening completely on their own. Okay, so this includes the diaphragm, which was contracted way down here. The fibers lengthen and ultimately go up into the rib cage, right? So in this direction. And so now this volume is much less than this volume, right? So the volume is decreasing. Also, we get the external intercostal muscles relaxing, right? So the chest was up here. Now the intercostal muscles relax, and so the ribs depress a little bit, and therefore volume further decreases, right? As we know, as volume decreases, the pressure of the air existing within that area is going to increase, and we see that here. We see that now there are 763 millimeters of mercury. Again, the numbers themselves aren't important, but what is important is that this here in the lungs is much higher than the pressure outside your body, right? You're not going to change atmospheric pressure just by breathing, right? So all of these changes are happening in your lungs not in the atmosphere. Okay? So again, the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, which means that the intrapulmonary pressure is going to increase, right? And it's going to become greater than the atmospheric pressure outside. As we know, air flows down its pressure gradient, and so it's going to go from high pressure out of the body to the lower pressure outside. And it's going to do this until an equilibrium is reached. Okay, so we have the intrapulmonary pressure is now greater than atmospheric pressure. Okay, and as I said in the last slide, you're pretty much looking for where the arrow is pointing on this greater than, less than sign. And so the air is going to flow from in the lungs out into the atmosphere when intrapulmonary pressure is greater than atmospheric pressure. Again, this is quiet expiration. Forced expiration is an active process. It requires you to use your abdomen as well as your intercostal muscles. Your internal intercostal muscles, that is. Okay, so let's come back for a moment to this atelectasis. Remember that inspiration and expiration only work as long as that pleural membrane, or both layers of the pleural membranes, are intact. There are a variety of ways that you can get lung collapse, one of which is pneumothorax, right? Air is entering into your pleural cavity. And this occurs, of course, when the intrapleural pressure is equal to or greater than the intrapulmonary pressure. Okay. You can also get hydrothorax, right? So some fluid building up on your lungs. If a tumor develops in between those two membranes, right, that can also decrease the surface tension and ultimately push on your lung until it collapses. Any kind of scar tissue, again, building up distance between these two membranes, and as a result, this can lead to a smaller lung. And finally, obstruction, right? So any kind of mucus or foreign object or anything that is pushing those membranes apart, this can lead to collapse. Okay, one more question before we move along. Which of the following relationships best demonstrates when inspiration will occur? Now, of course, you can look at this and it just seems like a bunch of gibberish, but as we just talked about, follow the direction of the signs. All right, so first of all, equal sign. Right, equals means that there's an equilibrium, and so there is no air flowing between the atmosphere and your lungs, right? So this is not inspiration, this is between inhale and exhale. Okay, next, intrapulmonary pressure is greater than atmospheric pressure, right? So what does that mean? Well, we follow the direction of the sign. We know that air is flowing in the direction of the arrow, right? So air is flowing from the lungs into the atmosphere, right? So this would be an exhale, right? From in the lungs to the atmosphere. All right, next, intrapulmonary pressure is less than atmospheric pressure. Okay, so follow the direction of the arrow. Air is flowing from the atmosphere into the lungs. All right, so therefore this would be an inhale. This is inspiration. Good. And just to be thorough, D, why is this one incorrect? Here, intrapleural pressure, so the pressure in between the two layers of the pleural membrane, that pressure is greater than the pressure in the lungs, and so we follow the direction of the arrow here, and we see that the pleural membrane, so the surface of the lungs, are pushing into the lungs, and so this is lung collapse. This is atelectasis. So our answer is C. Okay, the final topic that I'm going to leave you with today is what exactly affects pulmonary ventilation. Okay, so what can change these different pressures and these different volumes and ultimately lead to changes in inhaling and exhaling? 3 different factors. We have airway resistance, surface tension, and lung compliance. The first physical factor that affects ventilation, how much air is coming into your lungs physically, is the resistance that air faces on the way into your lungs. This topic should seem really familiar to our discussion on blood flow through our vessels, because the properties of physics are largely the same here. In fact, if we look at this equation over here, we see that the flow of, in this case, air, of gas, is equal to the change in pressure, right? So the difference in pressure from outside to inside over the resistance, right? And so this is exactly the same thing we talked about with our blood vessels. Air follows the same rules. And so we know essentially that the flow of, in this case, gas changes inversely with resistance, right? So if we take this wide open airway here and we constrict it, right? Bronchoconstriction, broncho for these airways as opposed to vaso for blood vessels. If we constrict our airways, we have now decreased the diameter, which increases the resistance, right? Air is not going to be able to flow through this airway as easily because there's physically less space to do so. And so bronchoconstriction is going to reduce the amount of air that can flow through your vessels because it increases resistance. Another concept that should seem somewhat familiar after our discussions about the cardiovascular system. Resistance in the airways is usually insignificant, right? There's usually not much resistance to the flow of air. Generally, because there is a lot of wide open space in our major airways. So our trachea and our primary and secondary bronchi, these are wide open, and so there is very little resistance. Now, of course, we know that the bronchi undergo 23 orders of branching, so split, 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 until we get these tiny little twigs with, of course, the alveoli, little leaves at the very end. And so these airways, of course, are getting smaller and smaller in diameter, so you would think that the resistance would increase. However, the great increase in the surface area, so the number of these little branches, is going to increase so much that we actually see the resistance go down quite considerably. Right? So the reason why we have 23 orders of branching is so that there is very little to no resistance that the air encounters. Okay. Before we move on, I want to point out again that the bronchi have cartilaginous rings. Okay, and so that always keeps these vessels open. They really don't change in diameter very much, if at all. But then as you get farther and farther down into the bronchioles, we start to see that there is a lot of smooth muscle wrapping around the outside of these airways. And so what that should indicate to you is that we can change the diameter of these vessels, right? So when the smooth muscle is triggered to contract, the wide open airway can get smaller, right? Narrower, and therefore increase resistance and decrease the flow of air through this airway and down into the alveoli. And so we can change the airway resistance, right? Subconsciously, due to our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system control. Okay. What I have drawn for you here are airways. The red is the smooth muscle surrounding these airways, and the little like flower shape inside is just because the epithelium kind of folds on itself a little bit when we constrict it or not. Excuse me, this is a constricted airway and this is a dilated airway. Okay, and we can control essentially which of these conditions we're meeting. First of all, bronchodilation. Right, so opening up of these airways into something that's much wider, much less resistance, and therefore more airflow. Bronchodilation is stimulated by our sympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system. Remember that when the SNS is kind of in charge and control of the response, epinephrine and norepinephrine, of course, are released, and they are going to bind to the beta-2 adrenergic receptors on the smooth muscle cells of our bronchioles. Okay, so this down here is a smooth muscle cell, right? They're kind of tapered on either end, and when epinephrine binds to this receptor, it is going to lead the muscle to relax and therefore open up and therefore allow more air in so that we can get more oxygen. The cardiovascular system is ramped up, so it's going to pump that oxygen-filled blood to all of our tissues, and we can get the heck away from that bear. Okay, remember, epinephrine, beta, and adrenergic. Remember the parasympathetic nervous system. Remember that the parasympathetic nervous system releases acetylcholine onto muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Right? So when that would happen, we would get ACH binding to the muscarinic cholinergic receptor, and those same exact muscle cells would constrict, therefore decreasing the diameter of the airway, letting less air in, right? If we're not running away from a bear, we really don't need tons of air getting into our lungs. So the autonomic nervous system produces these intentional changes in the resistance of our airways, therefore allowing more air in to run away from a bear or less air in if we really don't need that much air right now. Let's now talk briefly about a pathological condition that affects your airway resistance. Asthma involves the obstruction of small airways, right? So specifically, it is caused by the contraction of your smooth muscle cells, right? And as a result, those smooth muscle cells decrease the diameter of your bronchioles, right? So this diameter is much less than, of course, this wide open dilated bronchiole. Also, asthma is an inappropriate inflammatory response, an inappropriate immune response, and it's tied to a lot of different immune system conditions. And so this response includes a lot of mucus secretion into the lumen of your bronchioles. And so we can see here that there's a lot of extra mucus here, tons and tons of mucus within the bronchiole. And so just the presence of this mucus, additional mucus that is, we need some, is going to take the wide open lumen of this bronchiole, and it is going to very much decrease the diameter. And so this increases the resistance and decreases the airflow into the lungs. Also, there is an involvement of different antibodies and different chemicals such as histamine, which are all pro-inflammatory. And so there's a lot of swelling of your tissues, which even further reduces the lumen of your bronchioles. Okay, so one of the symptoms of asthma is wheezing, right? And so I just want to take a moment to talk about and remind you that inhale and exhale, one of these is an active process, one of these is a passive process. The inhale involves contracting your muscles. We use ATP, we shorten sarcomeres using cross bridges, and so that is the active process. So in order to inhale through this much smaller diameter, we can physically pull the air in past all of this extra mucus, right? That's the active process. We're much stronger inhaling than we are exhaling. When asthmatics go to exhale, this passive process isn't physically strong enough to get all of the air out of your lungs at the end of an exhale. Okay, so a lot of that air is still trapped in your lungs, and what you might find is that you actually have to use your abdominal muscles and you have to use your internal intercostals to physically blow that air out instead of just relaxing and letting it come out naturally. And so this process of pulling the air in and pushing the air out past this mucus essentially adds little bubbles to that mucus. And so the wheezing is actually the sound of that extra mucus and the bubbles, bubbles popping and the mucus becoming a little bit turbulent. So that's what wheezing is. And again, the exhale is the hard part, right? Because you're not supposed to be using your muscles actively in order to exhale. All right, so how do we treat an asthma attack? Well, of course, lots of different ways, some long-term solutions, some in the moment. Pretty much anything that bronchodilates is going to help you. So one solution is an EpiPen, if you can afford it, right? So epi for epinephrine. These EpiPens allow you to inject epinephrine into your blood, and of course epinephrine binds to beta-adrenergic receptors on your smooth muscle cells, and so those smooth muscle cells will relax, right? So one of the problems was that they were contracting. Now they're going to relax and open up that airway again so you can actually breathe. Okay, if you have an asthma attack, right, and all of a sudden think, oh my gosh, like this is an emergency, I might die here, right? I can't breathe, oh my gosh. And then all of a sudden you can breathe again, right? And so you keep on going, keep on, doing your thing, and then all of a sudden you can't breathe again. You think, oh my gosh, I'm gonna die. And then you can breathe again, right? So what's happening there? Well, essentially your body is releasing epinephrine, right? Your adrenal glands release epinephrine because you go into the fight or flight response, right? So epinephrine is now circulating in your blood and binding to these receptors on your bronchioles. They are relaxing, they are opening up your airway so you can actually breathe again, right? Real story, actually. All right, so there are other therapeutic ways of treating asthma. Pretty much anything that binds to those beta receptors, beta-adrenergic receptors, so anything that mimics epinephrine, right, or adrenaline. Okay, also anything that is anti-inflammatory is going to reduce the problem at its source, right? And so if the problem is that your airways are narrowed because of an overactive immune response, if we suppress that immune response, then you can breathe again, right? And of course, another option is anti-muscarinics, right? So remember, cholinergic or muscarinic cholinergic receptors bind to acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is released by the parasympathetic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system constricts your bronchioles. So if you block those muscarinic receptors, you can't detect ACH, and therefore there will be no further bronchoconstriction. All right, lots of little details. Hopefully you got all that. The second physical factor that affects ventilation is alveolar surface tension. And we talked a little bit about this earlier in this lesson, but now let's dig into it a little bit more. Remember that in order for respiration to occur, we absolutely need a thin layer of fluid around over the respiratory membranes, right? Oxygen must dissolve in fluid before it can cross over that respiratory membrane. The problem with this is that this fluid is made up of water, and water molecules are joined together by hydrogen bonds, right? This creates surface tension, and surface tension pulls molecules closer together. Now, because that water is sticking to the alveolar membrane, the alveolus itself is going to be pulled inward. And again, I mentioned this a little bit before. Okay, so the surface tension of the fluid covering the alveolar membrane is going to automatically pull the alveolus into a smaller configuration. Okay, the way that we counteract this surface tension is that we secrete what is called surfactant into the fluid. And that surfactant, remember, is secreted by the type 2 alveolar cells or type 2 pneumocytes. All right, we can see in this cell here that this surfactant is transcribed, translated by the nucleus. It is processed in the RER and the Golgi, and ultimately is exocytosed out into the alveolus, right? That's a little bit of AOP1 stuff, but of course it all connects back. Essentially, what these surfactant molecules do is they disrupt the hydrogen bonds in a detergent-like fashion, and so this allows the water molecules to be pulled apart from one another even more. Okay, so this surfactant is present in constant amount per alveolus, right? So the same, number of surfactant molecules, but as the alveolus increases, right? You are inhaling, your diaphragm and external intercostals are pulling your thoracic cavity larger, and therefore air is flowing into your alveoli and they're expanding, right? So these same number of surfactant molecules, which are directly disrupting the hydrogen bond interaction between the water molecules, are now going to be spread out farther from one another. And so now we have fewer surfactant molecules for a larger amount of space, and so the surfactant-like qualities are going to decrease in strength. And so take-home message here is that in a deflated alveolus, there are more surfactant molecules per the space, right? So they're going to be more concentrated. And so when your lungs are completely deflated, or as deflated as they get, that is, it's not going to take much effort to inhale, to inflate them, but the larger and larger they get, the harder it's going to be to keep inhaling. And so this is one of several ways that we make sure we don't overinflate our lungs. Okay. One other thing I want to mention while we're talking about alveolar surface tension is that these type 2 alveolar cells are some of the last structures that develop as a fetus. Okay, so this is important because, or rather, it's important to try to extend your pregnancy to full term, right, as opposed to giving birth earlier, right, way before your due date, because if the child is born before these alveolar type 2 cells are developed, it is going to be outrageously difficult, especially for this underdeveloped, very weak, never had to breathe before in its entire life child, to actually inhale against the surface tension, right, that is produced by the fluid within these alveoli. Okay, so one of the many reasons for the respiratory issues of preemies is because these type 2 alveolar cells are not developed yet. And so this causes infant respiratory distress syndrome. Not enough surfactant, so it is outrageously difficult to inhale, to take a breath. The third and final physical factor affecting ventilation, so inhaling and exhaling, is called lung compliance. And so similar to what we were just talking about, lung compliance is how much effort does it take to inhale, to expand the lungs and expand the thoracic cavity. Normally, compliance, or the stretchiness of your lungs, is pretty high, right? It's pretty easy to inhale because your lung tissue is distensible, right? It's really easy to stretch them, to pull the elastic on your sweatpants. And of course, if you have functional type 2 cells, your surfactant levels can very much reduce the alveolar surface tension. And so, usually pretty easy to inhale, right? There are many pathological conditions that can reduce your lung compliance, that is, make it much more difficult to take a breath, to inhale. First of all, fibrosis. So scar tissue is not elastic, it's not super stretchy, and so if you have been breathing in a lot of abrasive stuff, right, so maybe things like asbestos, maybe things like pollutants in the air, smoking, all of these things make it really difficult to inhale because scar tissue, again, is not elastic. Any reduction in the production of surfactant, and any problem with your thoracic cage. So Any reduction in flexibility or strength of your thoracic cage, or even volume of your rib cage, can decrease the compliance of your lungs. So for example, any deformity in your thorax. Right, so in this particular condition, the chest kind of bows inward, and so you obviously cannot expand your chest quite as much if you have this configuration to your skeleton. Ossification of the costal cartilages. This is an X-ray, and let me point out that the costal cartilages, if you remember from A&P 1, attach each of the 10 pairs of true ribs and couple of the false ribs. They attach the ribs directly to the sternum, and so normally cartilage is not visible on an X-ray, but here we have lots and lots of white, and so this costal cartilage has gotten a lot of calcium deposited on it due to an imbalance in calcium or genetic factors, whatever, and so now instead of being flexible and being able to expand fully and depress fully over an inhale-exhale cycle, this particular individual cannot really expand their lungs very much. All right, so no bueno there. And any kind of issues with your respiratory muscles. Right, so this image down to the right is an image of a normal patient and someone with muscular dystrophy. In muscular dystrophy, the dystrophin gene is mutated, so the extracellular proteins cannot connect to the muscle cell fibers themselves, and ultimately this leads to a lot of tearing of your muscle cells, a lot of breakdown of the components inside, and so your muscle cells end up dying off. And so remember that your intercostal muscles and your diaphragm are both skeletal muscles, and so if you have a mutation in your dystrophin gene, these muscles will become progressively weaker over time. Right? Dead muscle cells cannot contract very well. They can't contract at all, in fact, and so these individuals lose the ability to inhale over time, and usually respiratory issues is what ends up with fatality in dystrophy patients. And so in talking about these different conditions affecting ventilation, affecting actually breathing in and out, we can classify diseases according to whether they affect your lung compliance, right? How easy is it to breathe in, and airway resistance, right? How easy is it to breathe out? And so I give you this image down below, and this is where we're going to end today. This is borrowed from a Khan Academy video on restrictive and obstructive respiratory disorders that is fantastic. I highly recommend it. But what I want to point out now is that there are these two classes of respiratory diseases. Restrictive diseases essentially prevent you from inhaling, and so normally you would have this maximum volume of your lungs, but in restrictive diseases you have reduced lung compliance, and so your lungs can only maybe expand to like this, right? So you're losing all of this extra volume and therefore all of that extra opportunity to take in oxygen and oxygenate your blood. Okay, obstructive diseases, on the other hand, are a problem with expiration or exhaling. There's some kind of an obstruction in your airways, and because you can physically, actively pull air past these obstructions, right? The problem isn't with inhaling, it's with exhaling. And so the air can come in, but it takes so much effort to push that air out that usually a lot of air gets trapped in your lungs. And so your lungs can actually become a little bit larger, which sounds like a swell idea, but the problem is this air that's trapped in your lungs isn't actually being exchanged. It's just kind of hanging out there. It's not giving you any more oxygen, and it's taking up really precious space that could be used for new air with lots more oxygen. Okay, and so COPD, emphysema, asthma, etc. are all obstructive diseases because they literally block your airways. Air can come in, but it can't really get out very easily. Okay, and so that is the end of this particular lesson. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time.